Professor Anastasakis, thank you so very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. How do you see the historical evolution of populism and far-right movements in Europe influencing current political landscapes, particularly in the context of the recent European Parliament elections?
First of all, thank you very much for this kind invitation, and I'm delighted to take part in this interview. Now, on your question in particular, populism and far-right are two umbrella concepts. They are very, very broad in the way that they are understood. And in that sense, they include a lot of different far-right parties and formations. And in that sense, it's very, very difficult to always kind of group them together in one and understand them as one. Having said that, far-right parties, let me also add that far-right parties themselves are also not united as a whole, because they're so nationalistic that by their own nature, they have very, very specific goals that refer to their own nation state. With that in mind, when we see them all together, and of course, when we see them rising in contemporary Western and European politics in particular, they can be very disruptive, obviously, and reactionary to what we understand as mainstream democratic politics that we're used to in Europe during the last 80 decades or so. At the same time, far-right politics are changing in terms of how they evolve with the circumstances. Often we see them when they are close to power also softening somewhat their position as well. I believe that, as long as there is nationalism and the nation state as the main point of reference in international politics, they will continue to exist, advocating their extreme nationalistic, racist, and populist discourse, and especially in times of less growth and also economic inequality, when they will always be able to find an audience to appeal to. Also, and that's my final point, in times that democratic leadership also is not as strong and determined, then that also gives ground to far-right parties to be able to infiltrate and penetrate with their own kind of ideas.
Right. What happened in the European Parliament elections regarding populism and the far right? Is this a watershed moment in European history?
I wouldn't call it a watershed moment in the sense that, yes, there was an expectation before the elections, and there was a lot of publicity around this on the rise of far-right politics during these European elections. What we saw as an outcome was that more or less we don't see massive change. Obviously, there was some rise of far-right parties in many national European settings. But at the same time, the Christian Democrats managed to increase their own position in the parliament. The Liberals lost somewhat. The Social Democrats remain more or less the same. So we do see that mainstream parties kept their kind of numbers and their power within the European Parliament. Having said that, what we did see, and that was significant, is the rise of the far right in two particular countries in Europe, maybe the most influential countries. We saw them in France, and obviously we've seen the impact in the national politics as well, as Macron went straight into elections, but also with the AfD in Germany, and how the Social Democratic Party was particularly weakened in terms of that kind of development. So in these two countries that often matter in the way that European politics develop, we did see, this rise, and that's how it's being felt, I suppose. Rather than in the whole European Parliament spectrum, we kind of identify these two countries in particular.
Right. Considering the rise of far-right parties across Europe, as proved once again by European Parliament elections, can we draw parallels with similar movements in the early 20th century? What historical lessons should we keep in mind to understand and address the modern developments?
Well, let me say first that history never repeats itself in the same way, and in that sense, it is important to have this in mind. We never have exactly the same circumstances that will bring same outcomes over and over again. One thing, of course, that we do see is that we need to know what happened, because when we look at the past, we understand why the present has performed in the way that it has. And with that in mind, and given that we cannot see history repeating itself, we can always draw lessons from history on particular occasions. That's something that we can do. Now, one thing that we usually do with the current circumstances is whether we are seeing, the 1930s repeated in the rise of the far right, and to what degree 1930s are relevant. And it's true that the 1930s is a particular moment in European history because of that uniqueness of circumstances that led to the rise of so many fascist parties, and especially the Nazi Party in Germany. What we can draw as lessons from history is that you shouldn't appease leaders when they are in the most kind of aggressive moment. In that sense, the 1938 appeasement of Hitler could be, received as a lesson not to follow the appeasement of somebody like Putin, for instance, who has invaded Ukraine. Because if you do negotiate with that kind of aggressive behavior, then you should probably expect that he will try again to go for more and more territory. So there are some lessons. Another lesson that could be taken is that if you continue with persistent economic inequality in times of economic crisis, that is also a recipe that will lead far-right parties to gain in their strength. That's another lesson that we saw, obviously, in the 1930s would happen after the 1929 crisis.
In your 2001 article, Post-Communist Extremism in Eastern Europe, The Nature of the Phenomenon, you discussed the emergence of far-right parties in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland and Hungary, years before the governments of Kaczynski and Viktor Orban. Do you think the dynamics that led to the rise of far-right parties have changed in Eastern Europe? What patterns can you identify?
Well, let me say first that while far-right is a wider European phenomenon, it's not exclusively something which is East Central European. There are three things in my kind of reading of the European continent that may create some kind of divergence between what we call Western Europe versus Eastern Europe. First, obviously, there is the communist legacy, which was very long and totalitarian, and created some of the circumstances that can be amenable at times to a lingering of authoritarianism or to an appeal of authoritarianism. The communist legacy has been very important, and it has been a point of reference. The second is actually the older legacy of empires versus those who are colonized, and that, I think, is an important thing to bear in mind, because when we think of Europe, we often discuss post-empire Europe as if all the countries were actually colonizers, which is not the case. It was actually, countries in the west of Europe, like Britain, France, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, that were actually, the ones that had their overseas empires, and at the same time countries in Eastern Europe that were part of empires, from Poland down to Greece. And in that sense, we've got a division within Europe that also affects the way that politics have been developing, and especially nationalistic politics. And the third element, which is connected to the second in some ways, in terms of the far-right experience, is that division between civic and ethnic nationalism, in the sense that the understanding of the national development of the countries, and also the way that citizens are kind of embedded within this context, is very much like a civic understanding of it, versus the ethnic approach of minorities, especially in Eastern Europe, which is a much more longer historical kind of experience embedded in Eastern Europe, and sometimes defines the way that far-right nationalism is behaving and forming its ideology.
How has the narrative and strategy of far-right parties evolved from the post-communist era in Eastern Europe to the present day? Are there historical factors that continue to play a significant role in their resurgence?
Well, even in Eastern Europe, where I kind of divided roughly between that kind of civic nationalism versus the ethnic nationalism, history plays a very, very important role within the far-right parties in Eastern Europe and politics in general, in the sense that the national experiences of the countries themselves bear a very big impact in how politics develop in these countries. In that sense, we've got, for instance, the Hungarian experience, which is part of the also Hungarian Empire, for instance, okay? And all those, after Hungary became a nation state after the end of World War I, with a lot of people outside the Hungarian borders. That created a very special brand of Hungarian nationalism, for instance. Compared to Poland, that also had problems with the rule of law, similar to Hungary, but with a different background there, in the sense that Poland, being kind of surrounded and squeezed often between Russia and Germany, has a different kind of historical experience of a country being divided or its territory being taken by one or the other country. In that sense, there, the far-right experience and far-right nationalism is a different kind of understanding, in the sense that it can be either anti-German or very much anti-Russian. So it depends on the experiences of the countries in how far-right parties adopt and form their own nationalism.
Right. In the same article, you discuss 4 theses about the rise of far-right extremism, one of which is the revival of the fascist era. With the rise of Giorgia Meloni in Italy and her party, Brothers of Italy, and the rise of the AfD in Germany, do you see a revival of the fascist era?
Not in the way that it happened in the 1930s. As I said earlier, history doesn't repeat itself. There are lessons, but it doesn't repeat itself. Back then, the background was very, very different in the 1930s. It was about World War I, massive experience on how there were winners or losers, especially in the case of Germany. There was a clear loser then, and that defined very much how Germany developed, or during the very, the turbulent interwar era for all the countries in Europe, with the testing of liberal politics, but then which failed and led to authoritarian politics of the 1930s. So it's a very different background that led to World War II, of course, from the one that we are seeing today, because now we've got the European Union, and that is a different kind of context, very, very unique in the European continent, in how all the countries of the European Union have developed a degree of political and economic integration. So any kind of attempt by far-right parties or those who are, anti-European and very protectionist, nationalistic, any kind of process will have to go first through the dismantling of the European Union, which is not a very easy thing to do. In that sense, we are in a difficult moment, in history. And in that sense, Meloni is not Mussolini. AFD is not, any example of what happened during Hitler's Germany. But nevertheless, when we look at those parties, there are some seeds there that make these parties more amenable to some of those, fascist ideas, or the language, at least, and the rhetoric. With this in mind, of course, we have to also think that one very important and common issue that enables those parties to develop the discourse as they do is the issue of migration. Again, we didn't have that kind of migration context back in the 1930s. It's something which is happening, has been happening for a few decades now, but that under conditions of crisis, of course, migration becomes a very important scapegoat often, and an issue that all kind of far-right parties share in the European continent.
In your article, Europeanization of the Balkans, you underline how the EU membership process has transformed the Balkan countries in terms of consolidating democracy and the rule of law. When you consider the surge of far-right populism in Western Europe, can we talk about the Balkanization of Europe?
Overall, I don't use the term Balkanization because I think it's a kind of a stereotyping term of a region, of a very specific understanding of the region, and that doesn't refer to any kind of real conceptualization of what the region is about. My thesis back then was that conditionality is very important, coming from the European Union in particular, and especially in the political context, that was able to make those countries accept and adopt some of the norms that the European Union was asking them to do in return for membership. And in that sense, Europeanization, which of course is a much wider concept than this, was able to probably take place in those countries. So what I see in Europe is definitely not Balkanization, but what I see is a process of securitization and geopoliticization of Europe and of the European Union. And that is, of course, the result of the wars that are happening in the neighborhoods, and especially the full-scale invasion of Russia onto Ukraine. Faced with that kind of reality, and of course a competition coming from a more multipolar kind of environment, we are seeing a turn towards defense, a defense-oriented agenda that can probably change the nature and the spirit of the European Union to new trajectories that were not the ones during the past of the EU as an economic and a soft power exclusively. And one important risk for me, and that's where I see the risk for Europe, is what's going to happen with its normative agenda. The fact that this is a democratic group of countries that has adopted particular values and rules and procedures, and how, because of the geopoliticization and securitization of the environment, the EU will be dealing, especially as an external actor. To what degree, for instance, the European Union will continue to abide by its strong normative kind of values when having to trade with countries around the world, or when having to take decisions as part of its foreign policy. Even with the enlargement agenda, we have to think as to what degree the EU is not sacrificing some of its democratic credentials in order to bring in some countries that may not be ready to become members of the European Union. So in that sense, I'm not fearing Balkanization, but there is a process of geopoliticization that is giving a concrete direction, in a sense, to the European Union's future.
In your doctoral thesis, Authoritarianism in the 20th Century Greece, you examined the authoritarian ideology and educational policy of two dictatorial regimes in the 20th century, Greece, the Massacres dictatorship, and the military junta of 1967 and 74. What interactions do you observe between these two periods and the rise of Golden Dawn in the 2010 and the Greek Solution Party now?
Well, dictatorships in the Greek context and in the way that I have studied them also in the past are probably something which is of the past, in the sense that they don't present themselves as alternative modes of political power and governance, and have ceased to do so after 1974 and the transition from dictatorship to democracy in Greece. For instance, the situation in the 1930s and in the 1960s and between, it was a period when the military was a very substantial force in Greek politics. And in that sense, whenever there was a political crisis or party political crisis, they would present themselves as alternatives, as political alternatives to what was happening, in Greece. And that's why either in the 1920s and 30s, Metaxas was a military man as well. They did manage to intervene in politics in various times during those years of the interwar period, but also in 1967 when the colonels came and they, stopped the democratic process abruptly. So in that sense, the rise of far-right parties in Greece, and especially the Golden Dawn, is not something which is similar or reminds us of those times of capturing of power from the military in politics. It's a good thing, obviously, that the Golden Dawn, apart from a party which saw its ascendancy during the severe economic crisis in Greece, is also a criminal organization, and most of it is in jail now. And it cannot operate as a political party as such. There are other expressions, of course, of nationalistic and far-right politics in Greece, such as the Greek Solution, as you mentioned, which is a party which is extreme nationalistic. But it's at the same time one of those probably not sustainable kind of parties. We have seen during the last 3 decades, for instance, how there have been parties that managed to raise their percentages, like the Orthodox Popular Rally, for instance, of Karadziaferis in the 1990s and early 2000s, the independent Greeks as well, that cooperated also with Syriza during the mid-10, during the years of crisis. And these were, parties, far-right parties that kind of they came up and then kind of saw how they, also descended. And in that sense, I don't see that these being sustainable. They are disruptive. They have a reactionary kind of discourse, very much nationalistic, and they benefit definitely from when mainstream party politics in Greece are having problems to address issues or during periods of crisis. So that, I think, is the pattern of the rise and fall, of those parties. That's why, along with the Greek Solution, there are another 2 extreme nationalistic parties that managed to get MEPs during these elections, and it's that kind of pattern. Having said that, the fact that the far-right side of politics did manage to get all together around all 3 parties together around 1819, it's a kind of unhappy kind of development, but it does indicate a certain situation in the Greek context as well.
All right. In your research on authoritarian regimes in Greece, what historical patterns do you see re-emerging in contemporary European politics? What impact do you think the resurgence of far-right populism will have on the future of European integration and the EU's democratic values? Are we witnessing a cyclical pattern of populist surge similar to previous historical periods?
Okay, now populism and populist leaders will continue to exist, whether they are of the far right, whether they are of the far left, or whether they are not of the far right or the far left, populism will continue. As I said, it's a very big umbrella term that covers too many different modes of parties that it's impossible not to have them in the future. They will continue to be around. Now, let me give a specific example because you're asking of an experience of Brexit, because Brexit was the populist moment in Europe. And we have seen from Brexit how the European edifice was actually challenged by the country that wanted out of the EU, but also was very representative of Euroscepticism and Europhobia. Now, Brexit is the actual expression of both of the potential of populism, but also the negative side of populism as well. The potential because it did manage to take a country out of the European Union with all this turbulence that happened, in Britain, and we've got, that unique phenomenon of a country exiting rather than countries wanting to enter. But at the same time, it was so tough and so difficult that gave us a lesson to the other parties that may share, a similar Euroscepticism, that is not a very easy thing to attempt. And in that sense, I believe that the far-right parties of today that are very Eurosceptic and they are very reactionary on that, they have to tread at a two-level kind of process. The first one is how they navigate within their own national politics and how they create that kind of environment of reaction of their own politics and their own elites. But at the same time, what do they do with the supranational in Europe, where they have limits as to how far they can really be reactionary, because, if they are, they may lead their countries outside the EU, which is something that the populations do not want. And that is makes it much more difficult with, with far-right parties to kind of adopt to a full extent all the reactionary, nationalistic and racist rhetoric that they have in them.
And lastly, Professor, from a historical perspective, how concerned are you about the rise of far-right parties in European elections? Many pundits argue that the center-right and center-left have held strong, and there is not much to worry about. Do you agree with these pundits?
Well, I agree that it's not, this kind of real rupture with the past. And as I said from the beginning, it's we haven't seen, that kind of massive fear of a very big rise that can really affect things in a radical way. So we still have that kind of mainstream context that will continue to dominate in European politics, which is a good thing. Having said that, I do see two risks for the future. The first one is whether the far-right parties in Europe will decide to unite in the context of the European Parliament in order to create difficulties on issues such as migration or climate change. I do not completely exclude the fact that they may, present a united front, although it's difficult for them to do. The second risk is to what degree, especially the parties of the Christian Democrat bloc, the right-wing, center-right-wing parties, might be tempted to ally themselves on some issues or more generally and adopt part of the discourse of the far-right parties, which would then lead to what has been termed the so-called mainstreaming of the far-right discourse. We have seen this being developed, especially in the field of migration, where many other parties are often guided and conditioned and determined by what the far-right parties talk about migration. But it would be, there is a risk that sometimes maybe those parties, especially the center-right, might feel that they want to make some alliance in order to, promote their own kind of interests. One example, I finished with that, was when, for instance, the in the EPP, the European People's Party of the center right. They had for many years within their group Orban's party in Hungary. At some point, it was good that they finally decided to let go of Orban and expel him from that family. But in the meanwhile, because Germany needed the numbers and the votes from the Hungarian and right-wing party, they did keep him in the fold. That is a risk, I believe.
Professor Anastasakis, thank you so very much for your time. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.